In a home that once echoed with laughter, silence had become the heaviest presence of all. Daniel, a father carrying the unbearable weight of loss, found himself moving through their days like a shadow of the man he once was. His 7-year-old daughter, Lily, mirrored that silence in a way that broke him more than his own grief ever could. She had not spoken more than a handful of words since her mother's passing, retreating into a world no one seemed able to reach. In desperation, Daniel had turned to every possible solution: specialists, counselors, even tutors with glowing reputations. Each one came armed with charts, methods, and hopeful promises. But time after time, their efforts fell into the same void. Lily would sit quietly, her eyes lowered, her lips sealed. Every attempt to coax her back into life only seemed to push her deeper into the fortress of her own sorrow. Daniel, once a man of determination and certainty, began to believe that this silence was permanent. That the daughter he knew was gone with her mother, and nothing he could do would bring her back. The weight of failure pressed into his chest each night as he stood by Lily's bedroom door, listening to the oppressive quiet. He blamed himself endlessly, convincing himself that perhaps he was too broken to guide her, too consumed by his own mourning to lift her from hers. Yet beneath the layers of exhaustion and despair, a small, fragile ember of hope refused to die. For Daniel, the silence was not merely the absence of sound, it was the absence of connection, of joy, of family. He feared that if things remained unchanged, Lily would grow up defined not by the memory of her mother's love, but by the emptiness her absence left behind. And so, while every failed attempt deepened his despair, it also sharpened his yearning. He did not need a miracle of medicine or theory. He needed a way to touch the hidden language of his child's heart. The turning point came quietly, without fanfare, like sunlight slipping through a crack in the curtains. Daniel had not expected anything to change when he hired Grace, a young woman, with a calm voice and steady hands. To him, she was simply another attempt. Another name on a long list of people who might reach Lily where he could not. She seemed reliable during their brief interview, polite yet grounded, but Daniel had long ago learned not to place his hopes in appearances. By the time Grace entered their home, hope was a fragile thing he dared not touch too often. For the first few days, he hardly noticed her presence. She moved quietly through the house, keeping things in order without disturbing the heavy rhythm of silence that had defined their lives. Lily remained withdrawn, often sitting cross-legged on the living room rug with her toys untouched, her eyes vacant. Daniel assumed it would be the same pattern as before, a caretaker who tried gently, failed slowly, and eventually gave up. But Grace was different in ways Daniel only began to notice gradually. She never forced Lily to respond. She never spoke with the clipped patience of a professional trying to tick off a box. Instead, she brought with her a softness that seemed to invite rather than instruct. When Lily refused to answer, Grace did not fill the silence with anxious chatter. She simply sat nearby, humming softly, letting her presence speak what words could not. One afternoon, Daniel returned home earlier than usual. He pushed open the front door, expecting the familiar stillness that had haunted him for months. Instead, he froze. From the living room came a sound so alien, so unexpected, that he thought for a moment he had imagined it. It was laughter, light, unguarded, and startlingly alive. His heart stumbled in his chest, and his hands trembled against the doorknob as he leaned closer. He stepped cautiously down the hallway, unwilling to believe until he saw it for himself. When he reached the doorway, the sight nearly brought him to his knees. There was Lily, her small hands busy stacking brightly colored blocks into a wobbly tower. Beside her sat Grace, her braid falling loosely over her shoulder, her voice gentle but playful as she coaxed Lily into turning the blocks into numbers. Daniel stood frozen, gripping the frame of the doorway, as though it alone held him upright. For months, his daughter had lived inside a fortress of silence, unreachable by anyone, not even him. And now, in front of his eyes, she was laughing, not just smiling politely, not just mimicking the motions of play, but laughing with the unfiltered joy of a child. Grace leaned closer, pointing at the crooked tower. "How many blocks do you see here, Lily?" she asked softly. Lily counted haltingly, tapping each one with her small finger. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Her voice was shaky but real, trembling like a candle flame, and when the tower collapsed, she dissolved into another fit of giggles. Grace laughed with her, not mockingly but tenderly, as though she had been waiting all this time for that very sound. Daniel's chest tightened painfully, and tears threatened at the edges of his vision. He had prayed for this moment, through countless sleepless nights, had begged for it in the quiet of corners of his heart. Tutors, specialists, doctors, none of them had managed to reach his daughter. And now, a woman who had been in their home for only weeks had done what he thought impossible. He wanted to rush forward, to scoop Lily into his arms, and tell her how proud he was, how desperately he had missed this light in her. But fear held him back. He was terrified that if he moved too quickly, if he intruded upon this fragile miracle, it might shatter into nothing. So he remained at the threshold, silent, watching as though the scene before him were sacred. Grace brushed a fallen block aside and smiled. "See, even if it falls, we can build it again. That's the fun part." Lily nodded earnestly, her eyes shining in a way Daniel had not seen in months. The little girl, who had once turned away from every attempt at connection, was now leaning toward Grace, listening, responding, alive again. Daniel's hands shook as he set his briefcase on the floor, lowering it gently so the sound wouldn't break the spell. He felt guilt rising within him, guilt that it had taken a stranger to give his daughter back her laughter, guilt that he had not been able to do it himself. But beneath that shame was something else, something humbler and truer: gratitude. When Lily finally spotted him standing in the doorway, Daniel braced himself for her to retreat, to shut down as she often did when others intruded on her fragile world. Instead, her face lit up. "Daddy, look. I made 5, she exclaimed, her voice filled with pride. The words pierced Daniel's heart. His throat tightened so much he could barely answer, but Grace glanced up at him, her expression soft, almost as if she had expected this moment all along. "She's doing wonderfully," she said warmly. Daniel stepped forward slowly, each movement deliberate, afraid to disturb what had been so carefully nurtured. He crouched beside them on the rug, his expensive suit folding awkwardly against the fabric, but for the first time in months, he felt as though he was kneeling on holy ground. This was not about numbers or blocks. It was about connection, about the miracle of seeing his daughter come alive again. Grace guided Lily patiently, never rushing her, never scolding when the blocks toppled over. Daniel found himself studying Grace, as much as he studied his daughter, her calm tone, her unhurried gestures, the way she seemed to understand Lily's unspoken language without needing translation. He had hired her for her reliability, but she had given him something no some could promise: hope. That night, long after Lily had gone to bed, Daniel could still hear the echo of her laughter ringing in the halls. It unsettled him, not because it was unwelcome, but because it reminded him how long it had been absent. He sat alone in his study, his hands trembling as he replayed the moment again and again. His daughter's voice, her joy, her pride, it felt like a miracle he did not deserve. And at the center of it all was Grace, the young woman who had walked into their broken world and, with nothing more than patience and kindness, lit a spark where only darkness had been. For the first time in months, Daniel allowed himself to believe that healing was possible. It would not come easily, and it would not erase the scars of loss. But as long as Grace remained, he dared to hope that laughter might once again become the language of their home. Grace understood from the beginning that healing was not something that could be rushed. She saw it in the way Lily's eyes would dart away when questioned directly, in the way her small hands trembled when silence pressed too heavily. Where others had tried to force words out of her, Grace chose instead to offer stillness and presence. She did not fill every pause with instructions or corrections. She allowed Lily's silence to breathe, as though it too deserved respect. It was during one of those silences that the first breakthrough came. Lily sat hunched over a blank sheet of paper, her pencil hovering uncertainly. Daniel had tried countless times before to encourage her to draw or write, but she would always shake her head, unwilling to begin. Grace, instead of urging, sat down quietly beside her. She picked up another pencil and, without comment, began to sketch a simple shape: a heart. Her strokes were light, almost tentative, as if to say, "This is not a test, just a moment we can share." Lily glanced at the page, then back at Grace. For a long minute she hesitated, her small body tense with the fear of doing something wrong. Then, with the faintest sigh, she pressed her pencil to the paper. Slowly, shakily, she spelled 3 letters. M-O-M. The pencil wobbled, the letters uneven, but when the word was complete, Lily's hand stilled. Her lips parted just slightly, and in a whisper softer than breath she murmured, "Mom." Daniel, standing unseen in the hallway, pressed a hand to his mouth, his chest aching as though the sound itself had cracked him open. Grace did not rush to comfort Lily with platitudes. She did not tell her to be strong or to move on. Instead, she nodded with quiet reverence, her voice low and warm. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. Writing her name is a way to keep her close. You won't forget her." She reached for the paper, folding it gently as though it were sacred, then pressed it to her chest. "This is a gift," she whispered. "And I'll keep it safe for you." Lily's small shoulders loosened at those words. For months, she had buried the fear of forgetting, carrying it like a secret too heavy for her age. Now, with Grace's acceptance, that fear released its grip. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not the desperate, suffocating tears of solitude. They were tears of recognition, of finally being seen. She leaned into Grace's embrace, her sobs soft but freeing, as though someone had lifted a stone from her small heart. From that day forward, Grace wove healing into the fabric of daily life, never through demands but through gentle invitations. In the backyard, she brought seashells from the beach, scattering them across the grass. "Let's make families," she suggested, lining them up in clusters. "This shell is you. This one is your dad. This one is your mom. And this one," she added, holding up a smaller shell, "is me for now, just helping." Lily's eyes softened. She picked up one of the shells, turning it over in her hand as if it carried a hidden story. Grace began arranging them into shapes, first letters, then words. "This shell is C, this one is A. This one is T. Together, they spell cat." Lily tilted her head, and for the first time in weeks, her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Like a cat," she whispered. Grace's face lit with joy, though she contained it carefully, afraid to overwhelm the fragile moment. "Yes, exactly. Like a cat." She clapped her hands once, light and playful, and Lily's eyes flickered with surprise, as though the simple connection had opened a door inside her. Tentatively, she picked up another shell and placed it beside the others. "D," she murmured. "Dog." Grace's throat tightened, but she smiled wider, treating it as the greatest triumph in the world. "That's perfect," she said softly. And in that moment, Lily began to discover that words did not have to be frightening. They could be bridges. They could be games. Evenings brought another kind of magic. Grace would take Lily outside to the lawn and point to the stars. "Each one is a memory," she explained. "Memories don't disappear, even when people aren't with us. Their light stays." Lily's gaze lingered on the sky, her eyes wide with wonder. Then, with a trembling finger, she pointed at one particularly bright star. "That one," she said softly, "is hers." Grace squeezed her hand gently. "Yes, sweetheart. That's your mom's star. She'll always shine for you." For the first time since her mother's death, Lily spoke of her openly, not with fear but with longing wrapped in hope. Daniel, watching from the veranda, pressed a hand to his chest, tears streaking silently down his face. He had feared that Lily would forget, that silence would erase the woman they both loved. But now, because of Grace, he saw that memory could be strength rather than sorrow. The most profound moment came on a warm afternoon. Grace had written a simple sentence with chalk on the patio, "I am Lily." For a long while, Lily stared at it, her lips moving soundlessly as she traced the letters with her finger. Grace did not press her. She sat cross-legged nearby, humming softly, patient as ever. Then, in a shaky voice, Lily spoke, "I am Lily." The words were uneven, fragile, but they were hers. Her declaration. Her voice reclaimed. After months of silence, Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she clapped her hands with uncontainable joy. "Yes, you are Lily, and you are wonderful." Daniel, hidden just beyond the doorway, crumbled. His shoulders shook as he covered his face, overwhelmed by the sound he had longed for but feared he would never hear again. His daughter was alive in ways he had thought impossible. That night, as Lily drifted to sleep, Daniel lingered by her door, his heart both heavy and light. Grace had not only helped his daughter find her voice, she had given them both something far greater, the courage to believe that love, memory, and patience could rebuild what grief had tried to destroy. Daniel had built his grief into walls. Strong, cold, impenetrable walls. To those around him, colleagues, neighbors, even distant relatives, he looked composed, a man holding himself together for the sake of his daughter. But behind closed doors, the fade cracked. His wife's clothes still hung untouched in the closet, her perfume lingered faintly in scarves folded neatly in drawers. Each object was a ghost, and each ghost reminded him of how far he had fallen from the man he once promised her he would be. Every night, Daniel sat in silence long after Lily had gone to bed. He would pour himself a glass of whiskey, place it untouched on the table, and stare at the dark window as though answers might appear in the reflection. But nothing ever came, only the suffocating whisper of guilt. You failed her. You're failing Lily. Grace's presence unsettled this fragile rhythm in ways Daniel hadn't expected. At first, he tried to ignore it, convincing himself she was simply doing her job. But her patience with Lily, her quiet strength, her refusal to treat grief as something to be rushed, these things stirred something inside him he had not allowed himself to feel in months. Gratitude, yes, but also shame. Why had it taken someone else, a stranger, to reach his daughter when he could not? One evening, after Lily had finally fallen asleep, Daniel wandered into the kitchen to find Grace rinsing a glass. The hour was late, yet she had not gone to her room. She moved with the calm efficiency of someone keeping herself occupied, but there was a softness in her movements that made Daniel stop in the doorway. He wanted to retreat, to avoid conversation, but something in the quiet steadiness of her presence kept him there. They sat together at the table, the silence between them heavy, yet oddly comfortable. Grace did not press him to speak, did not fill the space with meaningless words. After months of being surrounded by pitying looks and empty reassurances, her restraint felt almost like mercy. Finally, she broke the silence, not with a lecture, but with a confession. I lost my brother, she said softly, her eyes fixed on her folded hands. He was 19. Wrong place, wrong time. The police never asked questions before pulling the trigger. Daniel's chest tightened. He had not expected her to reveal anything so raw. Yet she continued, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. My mother never recovered. And I still wake up some nights hearing his laugh. It's strange how a sound can haunt you, more than silence ever could. Her words pierced him. He wasn't used to others offering their wounds so openly. Most people tiptoed around his grief, treating it like a fragile relic. But Grace had placed hers on the porte-noir table without flinching, as though pain was a language they both spoke. Daniel swallowed. Hard, his throat dry. Against every instinct to stay guarded, the words slipped out before he could stop them. Since the accident, he whispered, I haven't touched her clothes. I keep them folded, untouched, as if I leave them there long enough, she'll come back for them. His voice cracked. He looked away quickly, ashamed of such naked vulnerability. But Grace didn't recoil. She didn't pity him. She simply listened, her silence steady, her presence unwavering. Daniel's hands trembled as he went on. Lily doesn't ask about her anymore. I don't know if it's because she's forgotten, or if it just hurts too much. Maybe she thinks I don't want to hear her name. And maybe she's right. His jaw tightened as tears pressed against his eyes. I don't know how to be her father when I can barely breathe through my own guilt. The words hung in the air, heavy and jagged. Daniel had never spoken them aloud, not to family, not to friends, not even to himself. And yet here they were, spilling into the kitchen, like a confession. Grace leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but resolute. Guilt is the cruelest lie grief tells us. My mother blamed herself for my brother's death for years. She thought if she had kept him home that night, raised him differently, loved him better, maybe he'd still be here. But there's no right set of choices that undo a bullet. Just like there's nothing you could have done to erase what happened. Daniel shook his head, his chest tightening with protest, but Grace gently raised a hand. You think you failed her. But loving someone doesn't mean you control fate. What matters is what you do now with Lily, with yourself. That's the part still in your hands. For a moment, Daniel could not breathe. Her words struck him deeper than any therapist's well-rehearsed sympathy. They weren't sugar-coated. They weren't pity. They were truth. His eyes burned as he let a single tear fall, the first he had allowed in front of another person since the funeral. Grace did not look away. She stayed with him in the weight of it, and that staying meant more than any words could. Their eyes met, and for the first time Daniel didn't look away in shame. Grace reached across the table slowly, giving him space to retreat if he wished. When her hand touched his, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't meant to heal everything at once. It was steady, warm, human. An anchor. Daniel inhaled sharply. For months, people had treated him as untouchable or broken, but Grace treated him as neither. She saw him as a man carrying unbearable pain, and worthy, still, of connection. He closed his fingers over hers, the gesture small but heavy with meaning. When she finally withdrew her hand, Daniel felt the silence shift. It no longer felt like isolation, but something shared. He leaned back, exhausted yet lighter, as though speaking had lifted a stone from his chest. For the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to sit with another person without hiding behind wealth, work, or detachment. Grace was no longer just the caretaker who managed tasks and soothed his daughter. She had become something else, someone who had carved out space where grief could be spoken, where pain did not have to be hidden. For Daniel, that realization was terrifying and liberating. At once, he understood now that sorrow could be shared, and in sharing, it could lose some of its power. That night, as he stood outside Lily's door, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing, Daniel felt something unfamiliar settle over him. Not joy, not yet. But hope. And he knew that Grace had given it to him, not by fixing what was broken, but by reminding him he did not have to carry it all alone. The meeting room at Willowbrook Elementary felt more like a courtroom than a place of learning. The long table was cluttered with reports, test scores, and evaluations. Teachers and administrators sat stiffly in their chairs, their faces already drawn with judgment before Daniel and Grace even entered. Daniel's stomach knotted as he walked in, Lily's hand clutching his for reassurance. He hated these meetings. They always left him feeling like an outsider to his own daughter's life, a defendant listening to accusations he had no power to refute. The principal cleared his throat and gestured toward the stack of papers. "Mr. Reed," he began, his voice measured but cold, "we've reviewed Lily's progress. Unfortunately, her academic performance continues to fall far below grade level. Specialists have confirmed what we suspected. There are significant delays. We recommend beginning behavioral therapy and a mild medication regimen to help her focus. Without intervention, her future success will be at risk." Daniel's jaw tightened. He had heard these refrains before, phrases wrapped in clinical politeness but heavy with condemnation. Unteachable. Deficient. Delayed. Each word cut deeper than the last, not because they were true, but because they carried the weight of finality, as though his daughter's story had already been written. Before he could respond, Grace leaned forward, her hands folded neatly but her eyes sharp with conviction. "Have any of you actually listened to her?" she asked, her voice steady. The room fell into uneasy silence. A counselor frowned. "Miss Grace, we're guided by data and research. Her scores speak for themselves. What you're suggesting, that she simply thinks differently, doesn't change the fact that she cannot meet academic expectations." Grace smiled sadly, but there was steel beneath her gentleness. "What you call failure is a misunderstanding of her language. You measure her with your ruler, but you refuse to see the candere bridges she's already building. Lily doesn't need a label. She needs someone willing to listen." A teacher bristled, tapping her pen against Lily's test scores. "We're not trying to harm her. Medication is a tool, not a punishment. It could help her concentrate, reduce frustration." Grace's voice sharpened. "A tool is only useful if it builds something. What you're offering is a cage, one that numbs instead of nurtures. She doesn't need to be silenced further. She needs to be understood." Daniel felt a surge of gratitude flood him, so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. He had wanted to speak these words for months, but could never find them. Grace, unafraid and unwavering, gave voice to the truth he had struggled to articulate. Perhaps sensing their authority slipping, one of the teachers leaned back in her chair and said, with a trace of challenge, "If her methods are so remarkable, why don't we let Lily show us? Let's see for ourselves." Daniel stiffened, suspicion rising in his chest. This felt like a trap. But Grace's calm expression never wavered. She nodded gently and turned to Lily. "Would you like to show them how you think?" she asked softly. Lily hesitated, her small hand tightening around her father's. For a moment, Daniel thought she would retreat into silence. But then Grace offered her an encouraging smile, the kind that said, "I believe in you, no matter what." Slowly, Lily nodded. A multiplication problem was scrawled onto the whiteboard 7x6. Several adults exchanged knowing glances, already expecting failure. Daniel's fists clenched under the table, his heart pounding with helpless rage. But Lily surprised them all. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a handful of bottle caps she had been collecting, setting them carefully on the table. She began arranging them into groups of 7, her small fingers working methodically. One group, then another. And another. 7, she whispered, pointing to the first group. 14. 21. Her voice grew stronger with each set. 28. 35. 42. She looked up, her eyes bright with certainty. It's 42. The room went silent. The accuracy of her answer was undeniable, but it was the explanation that followed which left them stunned. Lily pointed to the groups of caps. 7 groups of 6 is the same as 6 groups of 7. They're families. Each family has the same number, so no one is left out. Daniel's chest tightened painfully. His daughter had not only solved the problem, she had revealed a depth of reasoning more creative and human than any worksheet could measure. Grace clapped softly, her eyes shining. Beautifully done, Lily. But the teachers were not clapping. They shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their authority unraveling in the face of something they could no longer deny. They had called her broken, unteachable, incapable. Yet here she was, proving them wrong with bottle caps and sincerity. The silence stretched heavy across the room. For the first time, the adults who had been so quick to label her had no words. To deny her answer would expose their blindness. To accept, it meant admitting the problem had never been Lily, but the rigid system that refused to see her. Daniel's eyes burned as he blinked back tears. He looked at his daughter, proud but shy, her fingers still fidgeting with the caps as though waiting for correction. Instead, Grace brushed her hand lightly across his, an anchor reminding him to hold steady. For Daniel, the truth crystallized with clarity sharper than grief. His daughter was not broken. She had never been unteachable. She had only been waiting for someone to speak her language. And Grace had done what the system could not. She had given Lily permission to be fully herself. The meeting ended not with conclusions or signatures, but with silence, the kind of silence that cracks open certainties. As Daniel led Lily out of the room, her small hand tucked into his, he felt lighter than he had in years. For the first time, he wasn't carrying shame out of a nuisance. Those doors. He was carrying proof. And in his heart, he made a vow. He would never again allow others to dictate Lily's worth. It was Grace who first discovered the little notebook hidden beneath Lily's pillow. At first, she hesitated, unsure if she was trespassing into a sanctuary too private to touch. But when she opened it, the pages told a story too important to be ignored. The early drawings were drenched in grief. Dark clouds pressing down over stick figures of Lily and her mother, their faces blank, the world around them shaded in heavy strokes of gray. Each page was a silent confession, a map of sorrow drawn by hands too young to carry such weight. But as Grace turned the pages, something began to shift. The storm clouds thinned, faint. Streaks of light broke through, and small bursts of color appeared where once there had been only darkness. A yellow sun peeked timidly from a corner, then grew bolder across later drawings. By the middle of the notebook, the change was unmistakable. The figures of Lily and her mother were no longer alone. A new figure appeared, a woman in a dress shaded bright yellow, her hand resting gently in theirs. Grace's breath caught. She didn't need anyone to tell her who that woman was meant to be. The realization filled her with equal parts, humility and awe. She had stepped into their lives as a caretaker, yet in Lily's heart she had already become more than that, someone who belonged. Someone who represented light breaking through the storm. When Daniel saw the notebook, his eyes trembled with emotion. He traced the figure with his fingertip, lips pressed tight, as though afraid that speaking would break the fragile revelation. For months, he had feared that Lily's grief was swallowing her whole. But here, in pencil and crayon, she was showing them her way of survival. Her world was not empty, it was slowly being rebuilt. The most powerful moment came not on paper, but in the living room one evening. A storm rattled outside, the windows shaking with rain and wind. The three of them sat huddled by candlelight, the air filled not with fear, but with a strange, fragile peace. Lily fidgeted for a long while, glancing from her father to Grace. Then, with a determination far beyond her years, she reached for Daniel's hand. Gently, she placed it over Grace's, sandwiching her own small hand between theirs. Neither adult moved. Daniel's throat tightened, his breath caught as though the weight of the entire future rested in that fragile gesture. Grace's heart raced, her pulse thundering in her Fingertips. Lily didn't explain. She didn't need to. Her message was clear. She wanted them. Bound together, not as fragments of a broken household, but as something whole. Daniel closed his eyes, guilt and longing colliding inside him. He thought of his wife, of promises whispered in hospital rooms, of nights where grief was his only companion. Yet as Lily's hand anchored his to Grace's, he realized this wasn't about replacement. It was about continuation. His daughter wasn't asking him to forget. She was asking him to allow love to return, to weave past and present into something livable. That night, something shifted. The house that had once echoed only with silence began to carry new sounds. Lily's laughter spilling through hallways, Grace humming softly while she cooked, Daniel's voice softer, less guarded. The oppressive stillness that had haunted every corner gave way to warmth, to presence, to life. It wasn't that grief disappeared, it never could. But the home no longer felt like a mausoleum of what had been lost. It had become a place where memory and hope coexisted, where love had found a way to grow again in the cracks left by sorrow. And at the center of it all was a child's drawing, a symbol of rebirth. From clouds to light, from absence to presence, from silence to laughter. Lily had drawn not just her grief, but her healing. And in that quiet act, she had already written the future. A family reborn, not perfect, not untouched by loss, but alive. The afternoon was warm and quiet, the kind of day that asked for no grand gestures, only presence. In the backyard, beneath a soft stretch of sky, Daniel, Lily, and Grace stood together. There were no guests, no officiants, no cameras. Just three people who had walked through grief and found their way back to one another. Grace smoothed her yellow dress nervously, while Daniel rested a steady hand on her shoulder, as if to remind her that she belonged here. But the center of the moment was Lily. Her small hands trembled as she held a folded piece of paper. With Daniel and Grace kneeling on either side of her, she unfolded it and began to read. Her voice keyed but unwavering. Now I have two hearts taking care of me. One I was born with. And one that came when I needed it. The words hung in the air, simple yet profound, cutting deeper than any carefully written vow ever could. Daniel's chest ached as tears welled in his eyes. Grace covered her mouth, unable to hide her trembling smile. And then, as if the moment itself demanded it, the three of them folded into one another's arms, tears and laughter mingling, sorrow and hope blending into something whole. In that embrace, the truth became undeniable. Family was not only a matter of blood or names written on paper. It was built through presence, through staying when leaving would be easier, through love that chose to remain. What had once been silence and despair was now laughter, warmth, and a new beginning. This story reminds us that family is not defined only by biology, but by the courage to love again after loss. Healing does not erase pain, it transforms it into strength. Sometimes the people we least expect arrive to hold our hands when we need them most. And in choosing to stay, they become family too. If this story touched your heart, share with us in the comments. What does family mean to you? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss more heartfelt stories like this. Your support helps us continue bringing these moments of hope and healing to life.